Spec Ops The Line's inverted colors are already nailed to the mast as soon as the main menu opens. An upside-down American flag flutters over the sand-covered ruins of Dubai, while Jimi Hendrix's famous performance of the national anthem at Woodstock, an absolute icon of 60s counterculturalism and anti-war sentiment, plays over a distant speaker. But that is not all. This main menu screen will change as the player progresses deeper into the heart of this game's darkness. The inverted flag becomes more and more tattered, and the excerpts from Hendrix are from later and later in the anthem, where he adds more and more sounds of chaos and violence in between the fragments of melody. A sniper is seen in various poses, foolishly lighting a fire and later experiencing the reward for his poor fieldcraft. And once the game does actually start, it is revealed that I have not referenced Heart of Darkness for nothing. Captain Walker and his Delta Squad have been sent to investigate a signal emerging from the ruins of Dubai after 6 months of ominous radio silence. The transmission contains the voice of the colonel who had originally gone in, along with his 33rd Battalion, in an attempt to evacuate the city. The lost colonel's name? No, not Kurtz, but Conrad. Conrad with a K, as though in an effort to go back before Apocalypse Now, before Heart of Darkness, before Josef Theodor Konrad Korzeniowski ever even learned English and anglicized his name.
Hey, Cap! Captain Walker!
What is it, Lugo?
Got a situation, sir.
Mission critical?
No, sir.
Then take it up the chain, Sergeant.
Roger that. Lieutenant Adams.
I hear you, Sergeant. What's your status?
Status is chafed, sir.
You say chafe, Sergeant?
Yes, sir. A local airborne insurgency has infiltrated the U.S. zone designated as my pants. Sir.
Shut up, jackass.
Of course, the river and the jungle are nowhere to be found in this version of Joseph Conrad's tale. Drowning and malaria have been replaced by the much drier threats of dehydration and getting buried alive in sand. And along with the river, we have also lost the sense of languidity or torpidity, of Marlowe waiting months for rivets to arrive at the central station, or of Captain Willard's destructive indolence in his Saigon apartment. There is no sense in Spec Ops The Line of waiting for machinery larger than oneself to get into gear. It is, instead, an action-packed and honestly quite good cover shooter in which the player character is the driving force. The demanding combat is nearly non-stop and takes place in every imaginable corner of this ruined city. Office blocks, parking garages, hotels and casinos, upscale restaurants and shopping centers. Boats, planes, and buses all marooned in an ocean of coarse, rough, irritating sand. Destructible objects, particularly glass, allow you to shoot the floor out from under some enemies, while others can be buried beneath an avalanche of sand. In this way, the tactical, cover-based gameplay is tightly bound to the environments it takes place in. A rather tight ammo economy encourages you to try out whichever weapons happen to be available. The weapons themselves are varied and well implemented, although the M4A1 has a very strange rear sight block mounted several inches too far forward, and this Beretta is clearly ejecting 5.56 cases. As a matter of fact, all the guns do, except for shotguns and the MGL. Indulging in some quite violent executions rewards you with precious ammunition, and fountains of gore are on vivid display during the slow motion that briefly triggers on every headshot. The combat, then, is designed to be tactical, but yet dynamic. Gritty, but yet spectacular, almost to the point of parody or vulgarity, especially because most of the people you are killing are actually American soldiers. The story of how that ends up happening, of course, is directly connected to the way in which Spec Ops The Line tries to pull you, slowly and inexorably, deeper and deeper into the mystery and the horror of Dubai. It starts on the outskirts after Walker's squad find a jury-rigged transmitter, the source of the signal they have been sent to investigate. They also find a few dead soldiers of the 33rd, but that is no great surprise. Nothing has been heard from the battalion for 6 months. Like in Joseph Conrad's book, most numbers are either 3 or 6 for some symbolic reason. The real surprise occurs when we find that somebody has actually managed to survive. They appear to be locals, but of course mutual distrust devolves into a firefight that the player character inevitably wins. Soon, more concrete reasons to be fighting these Farsi speakers emerge. They have wiped out a squad of Americans from the 33rd and taken one of them prisoner. In the process of searching for this man, named McPherson, we discover another American, Agent Castovan, who is on the other side working with the locals. Clearly, Walker's squad has stumbled into some kind of mess that is above their pay grade, but the only way to figure out what the hell is going on is to get involved. After we find McPherson and watch him turn the tables on Castovan, we discover just how rare it is to find trust in a place like this.
Looks stupid to you?
No. That's why you're gonna point that pistol somewhere else.
Lower your weapon. I'll lower mine.
Not gonna happen.
You got a name?
McPherson, First Lieutenant. You?
Walker, Captain. We found your friend at the plane. He told us where to find you.
Really? Where's he at?
He didn't make it.
Why am I not surprised?
So what? You think we killed him?
I didn't say that.
You're not saying much of anything, Lieutenant.
Article 4, Captain. You gotta speak to my commander.
Well, where's he at?
By now, I'd imagine he's just downstairs.
Yeah, I'll bet.
McPherson assumes, not unreasonably, that Walker is working with Castovan, the CIA, and the locals. He informs his comrades to that effect, and just like that, we end up switching sides in the conflict. We are attacked by American soldiers from the 33rd, and then we stumble into their efforts to round up the civilian population. For the first time, unarmed civilians are present in the battle space, and there is no consequence whatsoever for killing them. In this rapidly dissolving morass of morality, nobody even acknowledges whether or not you happen to make a very easy mistake. The rest of the game is morally upended, but rigid. The 33rd become entrenched in their role as enemies, and civilians cease to be presented in this unscripted fashion. The truly interesting questions, therefore, surround this moment of moral fluidity, when the ship has capsized but not yet turned turtle. Up until this point, Spec Ops: The Line offers nothing unusual. The only thing worthy of comment is the aforementioned excellent combat. The murdering of stereotypical Middle Eastern insurgents is, in its own horrific way, completely played out. Boring, even. Spec Ops: The Line makes a bold and confronting statement by pulling the rug out from underneath that paradigm about 30 minutes in. But the very boldness of that maneuver prevents it from being executed with any degree of subtlety. In fact, the word I would use to describe this writing is clumsy. There is, quite simply, no reason for Walker's squad to go any further after their first fight with the 33rd. Once engaged in a blue-on-blue firefight, the responsibility of any commander is to terminate that conflict, even if it means withdrawing and abandoning the mission. And Walker would not be abandoning his mission anyway, because he has already exceeded his orders. At this point, he is supposed to go back and...
Radio command from outside the storm wall. You send in the cavalry, we go home.
He is not supposed to move forward and interfere in the operations of a friendly unit, even if those operations appear to him, with the very limited information he possesses, to be unjust. He says...
It's clear the 33rd is no longer acting as part of the U.S. Army.
But to me, that is not clear at all. The only evidence we have is them trying to enforce martial law on some civilians. We know the CIA has been stirring up the local population against the 33rd, or at least we would if we stopped for a minute and thought about it, but we have no idea why. It is irrelevant and unhelpful to ask who started this escalation, but the answer is certainly not to charge in and accelerate it. Only a few minutes ago, Walker said,
Every minute we waste could be the difference between a soldier going home alive or going home in a bag.
Those words are still true, but in the opposite sense from which he meant them. It is the mystery, though, the lack of information that keeps pulling Walker and the player further and further into the heart of darkness. He wants to know where Colonel Conrad sits in all of this, as the two of them have a personal connection. And the player could just hit Alt F4, and probably should, but then the destination of this moral roller coaster would forever remain a mystery. Furthermore, to stop now would be to somehow admit that you are too sensitive, too much of a snowflake, or that your national allegiance, if you do happen to be an American who cares about that sort of thing, is too fragile to survive even a virtual ordeal such as this.
You know, with all the shit going on, I forget how beautiful this place can be.
I feel you.
You know, sometimes at night I'll just come out here and sit. Just listen to the wind.
Yeah. Reminds me of how the wind used to howl through the trees where I grew up. Kinda peaceful, actually.
Hard to believe there's any peace in a place like this, huh?
You gotta look for peace no matter where you are, man. Helps remind you what you're fighting for.
Yeah, true that. Anyway, thanks for the gum. I'm gonna go check upstairs.
Anytime.
It would be easy and simple to say that Heart of Darkness is to the white man's burden, as Apocalypse Now is to the Green Berets, and as Spec Ops The Line is to Call of Duty or Medal of Honor. Obviously, that comparison is neither simple nor easy, but Heart of Darkness does overtly oppose itself to Kipling's evangelical jingoism before Marlowe even sails for Africa. He goes to see his aunt, who thinks that he is, quote, one of the workers, with a capital, you know, something like an emissary of light, something like a lower sort of apostle. There had been a lot of such rot let loose in print and talk just about that time, and the excellent woman, living right in the rush of all that humbug, got carried off her feet. She talked about weaning those ignorant millions from their horrid ways till, upon my word, she made me quite uncomfortable. I ventured to hint that the company was run for profit. End quote. Conrad, then, identifies the enemy as the enemy quite early on, as it turns out the root of Kurtz's evil is that he believes he is carrying the white man's burden. Spec Ops The Line, of course, lines itself up against the shallow shooters that present American interventionism as necessary or helpful, while Apocalypse Now positions itself as directly anti-Vietnam War. But already, with Marlowe's aunt, two things are emerging that separate Heart of Darkness from its would-be successors: capitalism and, to a lesser extent, religion. In the 19th century, imperialism was an overtly capitalist phenomenon, and as such the book is just as much an anti-capitalist work as it is an anti-imperialist one. Once Marlowe reaches the interior, he observes that, quote, there was an air of plotting about that station, but nothing came of it, of course. It was as unreal as everything else, as the philanthropic pretense of the whole concern, as their talk, as their government, as their show of work. The only real feeling was a desire to get appointed to a trading post where ivory was to be had so that they could earn percentages. They intrigued and slandered and hated each other only on that account, but as to effectually lifting a little finger, oh no. End quote. This capitalist jockeying for position is briefly touched on in Apocalypse Now, but is completely absent from Spec Ops The Line. Military hierarchies are inherently more rigid and inflexible than capitalist ones. Captain Willard refers to the Army's bureaucracy as a metaphorical corporation once or twice, and you could draw a similar parallel to the CIA in the game's case, but Heart of Darkness does not merely reference cutthroat capitalism. It is absolutely permeated with it. Conrad constantly hammers the reader with reminders that in this dark fringe of the world, money is worth more than human life. Money, most often from ivory, which is elevated to the position of an idol. And that idolization is a part of the book's religious overtones as well. The word pilgrims is repeatedly used to refer to the company men who are going upriver in search of ivory. Kurtz, more directly and quite uncomfortably for modern readers, believes that, quote, we whites, from the point of development we had arrived at, must necessarily appear to them, savages, in the nature of supernatural beings. We approach them with the might as of a deity, end quote. When we finally meet Kurtz, who is indeed playing God among the natives, his shaven head is metaphorically described as sculpted of ivory, granting him the same status as that idol of capitalism. Apocalypse Now may be missing the capitalist element, but as regards the white man's burden, this Kurtz apparently did his master's thesis on the Philippine-American War. the same conflict that inspired Kipling's poem. And in the end, the film somehow goes even further down the religious lane than Heart of Darkness ever did. This makes for an interesting allegory, but I actually think it detracts from that film's effort to cast itself as specifically anti-Vietnam. There certainly are and were evangelical overtones to America's political interventionism, but Kurt's playing God in the jungle can be nothing more than allegorical in the 1960s. In fact, the whole concept is deeply misrepresentative of the contemporary people of Cambodia, where the ending is set, and the Philippines, where it was filmed. Far more interesting and more applicable to real contemporary issues is the way in which the African American members of the PBR's crew step into the shoes of Marlowe's Congolese engineer and helmsman. Perhaps correctly, Spec Ops: The Line does not go anywhere near this morass of religion and race. You would be hard-pressed to find any examples of even metaphorical idolatry, and while Adams does happen to be black, it has no real impact on the story. But both the game and the film have to contort themselves into implausible shapes to explain how this colonel was able to go so thoroughly native in a world of radios and helicopters. Heart of Darkness ties its examination of evil directly into the key contemporary issues of colonialism, capitalism, and social Darwinism, but its successors are trying to adapt that same story to fit their own eras, like a Shakespeare play that has been set in 1930s Germany. There are interesting parallels, but it will never fit quite as well. 21st century interventionism is, at least nominally, a political and humanitarian phenomenon. The whole point of the 33rd going into Dubai was to evacuate the civilian population, not to convert them to Christianity or to get a hold of their oil. If this really was a retelling of Heart of Darkness, the word oil would be on every other page, like ivory was in the original. Instead, I believe I'm correct in saying that oil is never even mentioned. The words that do keep popping up are rescue and evacuation. But, of course, different intentions do not always yield different results. What these three pieces of art do share is the concept of madness, insanity, ridiculousness, or craziness. The sense, I suppose, that what happens in the jungle stays in the jungle. It is undeniably there in the original. There's the French man of war throwing shells not at any discernible target, but into the immutable vastness of the continent. There is the accountant who, despite living more or less in the wilderness, is wearing, quote, a high starched collar, white cuffs, a light alpaca jacket, snowy trousers, a clear necktie, and varnished boots. No hat. Hair parted, brushed, oiled under a green-lined parasol held in a big white hand. He was amazing, and had a pen holder behind his ear. End quote. One of the pilgrims going upriver is, quote, a little fat man with sandy hair and red whiskers who wore side-spring boots and pink pajamas tucked into his socks. End quote. During the attack on the steamboat, the frenzied eagerness with which the pilgrims obscure everything in a cloud of gun smoke almost makes yakety sax start playing in the reader's mind. And at the final destination, there's the bipolar and possibly homosexual Russian who, quote, looked like a harlequin. His clothes had been made of some stuff that was brown holland, probably, but it was covered with patches all over, with bright patches, blue, red, and yellow, patches on the back, patches on the front, patches on elbows, on knees, colored binding around his jacket, scarlet edging at the bottom of his trousers, and the sunshine made him look extremely gay and wonderfully neat withal, because you could see how beautifully all this patching had been done. A beardless, boyish face, very fair, no features to speak of, nose peeling, little blue eyes, smiles and frowns chasing each other over that open countenance like sunshine and shadow on a wind-swept plain. End quote. In Apocalypse Now, Coppola leans even further into ridiculousness and madness, but it is no longer the capitalist frenzy of a gold rush or of a Black Friday sale. It is instead recast as the madness and insanity of war. And that is where Hendrix's anthem and inverted flags begin to fit in with this legacy. There is, of course, Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore, famous for his love of Wagner and surfing. He is only convinced to help Willard get through the river delta when he is informed that there is a good 6-foot peak there, with a long right and left slide and even a bowl section, whatever that means. Further upriver, there is the hysteria surrounding the helicopter delivery of several playmates into the depths of the jungle. And the patchwork Russian at the end of the voyage has been replaced with a hippie photojournalist who either prefaces or punctuates just about every statement with the word man. The closest thing there is to that character in Spec Ops The Line is the radio man, the DJ of Radio Dubai. The licensed music he plays through speakers scattered throughout the city probably has something to do with why this game is no longer available for purchase, but that music, along with a lot of artfully irreverent graffiti and the Stalingrad-esque improbability of some of the environments combat takes place in, certainly carries forward the tradition of ridiculous, mad insanity. The DJ even plays Ride of the Valkyries at one point, although it is buried beneath a helicopter chase sequence that is both too intense and too short for Wagner to really speak. The Radio Man, however, is really the only source of this madness. In sharp contrast to Apocalypse Now, most of the soldiers here behave quite professionally and rationally. And when Captain Walker himself emerges as another source of insanity, it is in a much more serious and hardcore sense. After suffering burns to the right side of his face in a severe crash, he begins to experience regular hallucinations. Clearly, the things he has done and seen have begun to add up to too much. Instead of a business-like, he begins to say things like, or, but I should probably explain what Walker has seen and done and why it has had this effect on him. When last we checked in, he was just in the middle of deciding that the 33rd are definitely the bad guys. As time goes on, Walker becomes more and more entrenched in that position and, as a result, more closely allied with the CIA. After Castovin's death, however, there are only 2 members of that organization left in Dubai, Gould and Riggs. We meet Gould first, and it is through him that Spec Ops The Line toys with the idea of giving the player a choice. Lugo wants to open fire immediately to save Gould, but Adams wants to wait, let Gould die, and take a stealthier approach so that we can save some civilians instead. However, like the civilians caught in the crossfire earlier, this choice matters more to the player than it does to the game. Gould dies of his wounds even if you side with Lugo and intervene early, and given what happens in the rest of the game, the civilians probably die either way as well. The whole episode, then, is an exercise in futility, an expression of just how little of a difference one person can make in the madness and chaos of war. The ensuing argument between Adams and Lugo is written so that it fits no matter which of their routes you took. And when, in the next chapter, Lugo insists that we do have a choice when it comes to using the white phosphorus, this fiasco with Gould has prepared us to agree with Walker's response.
You're fucking kidding, right? That's white phosphorus.
Yeah, I know what it is.
You've seen what this shit does. You know we
Might
can't
not have a
use it.
choice, Lugo.
There's always a choice.
No, there's really not.
That is about as good as the writing gets in Spec Ops The Line, but it still takes for granted that the player is going along for the ride. Immersion without choice requires a narrative that guides the player through its twists and turns in such a way that if there had been a choice, this would have been the choice to make. Most crucially, the player needs to willingly cross the threshold alongside the hero. But Walker is too much of an anti-hero, and this story too unsubtle in its messaging for that to ever work, no matter how good the writing is. At no point did I ever feel that my choices were the same as Walker's, because his choices, and he does, despite his insistence, make choices that matter, the Willie Pete included, His choices are, more consistently than in any other game I've played, not the choices I would have made. I identify more with Captain Willard or Marlowe because if they behave irrationally, it is due to the irrational situation they find themselves in. But Captain Walker, perhaps because he is the main character of a third-person shooter, is himself the situation. The carnage and insanity is, in most cases, due to the choices he insists he isn't making. And when the game decides to confront that fact, when it tries to, in Nakey Jakey terms, talk about the alligator under the bed, it ends up going the way of The Last of Us Part 2. It becomes anti-immersive because the player has not taken any ownership of those choices and consequences.
It is fair to say, then, that I do not think Spec Ops: The Line presents a convincing rationale for the mutinous conflict it portrays. But the blue-on-blue killing in itself gives rise to some very interesting and confronting questions. What is it about killing an American soldier that's so much worse than taking any other human life? What makes a life from Ohio worth so much more than one from Dubai, or more plausibly, Afghanistan? And why do I only start questioning the plausibility of a video game story once it starts making me headshot and execute people who like Fleetwood Mac just as much as I do? Why don't I hold Call of Duty or Far Cry to the same standards?
Even Far Cry 5 and Mafia 3 do not feel like this because while the enemies are Americans, the religious extremism and the racism still provide moral justifications. It takes unjustified, avoidable, or unnecessary killings, such as that depicted in Spec Ops: The Line, for these questions to be raised about imperialism, interventionism, and the entire paradigm of violence in video games. When the violence is presented, bereft of any recognizable justification or moral framework, we suddenly realize just how ugly it is, no matter how it might be morally framed or justified. But in choosing to be so utterly deconstructive and iconoclastic, this game sacrifices any chance it might have of telling an immersive or compelling story. It cannot explain, justify, or contextualize the horror. It can only show it.
That hotel back at the storm wall? No, those can't be the civvies that got kidnapped. It's not possible.
Yeah, it is. That's why Gould stormed this place. He didn't want the gate.
He was trying to rescue his people. This is your fault, goddammit! Stop right there, Lugo. What it is, you wouldn't we didn't have a choice. He turned us into fucking cowards. That's enough, Sergeant. No!
We need to keep moving.
What?
Reinforcements will be here any second. We need to keep moving.
But Walker, you're not even...
I'm gonna make these bastards pay for what they've done. Now, are you with me or not?
These depictions of needless suffering are also, of course, a part of the Heart of Darkness tradition. Marlowe, for example, encounters a grove full of people who have, more or less, been worked to death. Quote, "Near the same tree, 2 more bundles of acute angles sat with their legs drawn up. One, with his chin propped on his knees, stared at nothing in an intolerable and appalling manner. His brother phantom rested its forehead as if overcome with a great weariness, and all about, others were scattered in every pose of contorted collapse, as in some picture of a massacre or a pestilence." End quote. Apocalypse Now does not have as much time for these specific, morose contemplations, but it has probably set its share of cultural standards when it comes to the sheer irreverence with which it treats death and suffering. But in sharp contrast to the book and the film, in Spec Ops: The Line, this suffering is not just there to be observed and contemplated. It is, arguably, the player character's fault. The player, of course, might have some strong feelings about being played like this. You might say, as Walker does, that your hand was forced by the 33rd, by the game, or by the developers, depending on your level of immersion. Or you might think, as Lugo does, that it is Walker's fault if you are refusing to take ownership of the captain's actions. Or you might say that after killing so many Americans, none of this really matters anymore. This moment, more than any other, is at the center of the discourse and controversy surrounding Spec Ops: The Line. The game itself tries to make some commentary on it near the end, but there are no answers to be found here. Only questions. For Walker, as much as he denies it, the white phosphorus is the moment at which doubt begins to creep in, at which he begins to think he might be at fault. But to fully admit that would be for all the killing and dying so far to be in vain. We press on then, driven by that sunk cost and by the idea that it was all the 33rd's fault anyway. After Gould, the last CIA man in Dubai is the Python-wielding Agent Riggs. We help him steal the city's water supply, contained in several tanker trucks, because in a place this arid, water is life and therefore power. When the 33rd tries to stop us, though, Riggs decides that nobody should have the water. He crashes the trucks, and this is where the burns on Walker's face come from. Riggs explains that in the cold calculus of geopolitics, it would be better for everyone in Dubai to die and for the outside world to never find out, because otherwise these events would spark a war of much larger proportions and much greater death tolls. It is hard to fault his logic, or perhaps his logical insanity, and as such this crash does not just scar Walker's face. It smashes an irreparable breach into the edifice of his belief that he is in some way helping, that he is somehow saving the civilians of Dubai from the 33rd. The ensuing war between different parts of his mind, symbolized by the two now different sides of his face, is probably the cause of his subsequent hallucinations.
Walker, what are you doing? Adams, you can't do this, man. Stop! Just fucking stop! Damn it, Walker! No! Jesus, what the fuck did you do, Walker?
You caught me off guard.
There is one other moment I'd like to mention, one that is often discussed alongside the white phosphorus mortar. In my opinion, however, this is the more interesting of those two catastrophes. The consequences are immediate and take place in the gameplay itself, not merely in a cutscene shown afterwards. After Lugo gets lynched, perhaps not unreasonably, by a mob of civilians, Walker and Adams open fire on the same mob, driving the civilians away. Those are the simple facts of the story, but the motivations for both player and character are far more complex. Once again, there is no real choice other than the choice to continue playing. Inaction results in you getting stoned to death, only to find yourself resurrected into the same predicament. For the story to continue, you have to open fire on unarmed people who, in an amazingly artful touch, still make your reticle turn blue, not red. But in the absence of choice, you can still choose your motivation. This can be vengeance for the death of Lugo, or it can be self-defense. It can be something you want to do, or something that you are forced to do. Or, perhaps, a mixture of the two. You might be wondering at this point how in the hell any ending to this game could possibly cash all of this in and answer all of these questions. Spec Ops: The Line is trying to do a lot all at once. It is trying to deconstruct American interventionism and its portrayal in media, in emulation of Joseph Conrad's deconstruction of European evangelism, capitalism, and colonialism. It raises questions about the circumstances through which friendly fire or the death of civilians can occur, but in my opinion, an allegory like this is much less suited to tackle those subjects than a game or film about an actual war. The same is true for the issues of combat stress or PTSD. Like the allegory of Apocalypse Now, Spec Ops: The Line likes to think of itself as anti-war, but has forgotten that to be anti-war still requires a war. An actual, plausible, no bullshit war. Generation Kill, Hamburger Hill, Das Boot, All Quiet on the Western Front, and even something as seemingly jingoistic as Fury all do a much better job of being anti-war simply because they portray their respective wars more accurately, with all of the good and the bad, and with all the complexities of their morality or immorality. But you will note that none of those are video games. The closest thing we have to a video game of that sort is probably Call of Duty World at War, but I would also argue for strategy games. Those have no qualms about showing the friendly casualties that can result from your own decisions or ineptitude. And they were your decisions, not those that some writer or developer is trying to get you to accept.
Riggs? Dead. Good. No, not good. He fucked us. Fucked everybody. Thanks to him, everyone in Dubai will be dead in a few days. The city needs to be evacuated ASAP.
Yeah, I'd love to know how you plan on doing that.
Lugo?
Oh, my bad. Am I interrupting?
Damn it. Sit tight, Lugo. I'm on my way.
I'll make sure he gets the message.
Go fuck yourself.
Whoa. Let's keep it clean, buddy. This is, after all, a family program. Rated E. For everyone thirsty.
Spec Ops The Line, then, especially at the end, is not anti-war or anti-interventionist. It throws Conrad, Hendricks, and Coppola over the side in an effort to become something completely different. An anti-game game. The killing of Americans, the deaths of civilians, and Walker's psychotic breaks and hallucinations are all leveraged, but not to make some point about war or American imperialism. Instead, it is all cast as the player characters and, therefore, the player's fault. This insistence becomes ever more painfully direct as Walker fights his way through the last enemies standing between him and Conrad. The DJ goes so far as to poke fun at his own game's finisher system.
It just gets me to wondering, who goes around bashing people's heads in? With a gun, no less. It's unnecessary and impractical.
But that is as close to making fun of itself as Spec Ops The Line ever gets. Most of this messaging is instead directed at the entire genre, or, worse, at the player.
Ah, jeez. Where's all this violence coming from, man? Is it the video games? I bet it's the video games.
Towards the end, the loading screen hints go from hinting to preaching, saying things like, "How many Americans have you killed today? Do you feel like a hero yet?" Or, most cringeworthy of all, "The US military does not condone the killing of unarmed combatants. But this isn't real, so why should you care?" The fourth wall is not just broken, but utterly demolished. The rubble swept up and taken away to the landfill, any hope of immersion or investment in the narrative completely out of reach. When Walker finally walks into Conrad's penthouse, he finds the Colonel hard at work on a piece of art that I think represents the masterpiece that Spec Ops The Line would like to see itself as. An idolization, a remembrance of the virtual or real death and suffering that we so often enjoy, ignore, or try to forget. This game thinks it is Hendrix at Woodstock, reminding the crowd that even in the midst of their countercultural escapism, there are still Americans killing and dying in Vietnam. This painting takes us back to that much discussed and non-optional use of white phosphorus. It shows that woman Walker saw clutching her child, their faces contorted and their flesh melted. But in its attempt to make a monument out of that moment, Spec Ops The Line only draws attention to the fact that the player had no say in it. It is presented as Walker's fault and the player's, but I would be surprised if any player would actually accept that blame. As Walker and Conrad continue their discussion, it is revealed that, in this version of the story, there is no Kurtz. Instead, we brought all of this evil with us, like Luke going into the dark cave. The transmission from the beginning was actually Colonel Conrad's suicide note. He has been dead all this time, his voice over the radio just another of Walker's hallucinations. The ensuing ending is very similar to that of Fight Club, but it is the only place where the player is afforded any real choice. If you don't pull the trigger, Walker dies and that's the end of it. The other option is to shoot the imaginary Conrad, banishing him forever. Walker then sends out another transmission requesting an evacuation, and when the fresh troops arrive, and Walker is waiting for them in Conrad's uniform for some reason, there is one final choice. You can submit and lay down your AA-12, letting them take you home. Or, if you demand that the game must go on, if you decide that you desire still more virtual lives to be sacrificed at the altar of your entertainment, you can kill them all, pick up their radio, and say,
Gentlemen, welcome to Dubai.
As much as I have criticized the logic of this narrative and its failure to get the player to buy in on Walker's choices, the one place where it does succeed is in being an anti-game. A game you aren't supposed to play. I said before that to be anti-war requires you to get the war part right, and while Spec Ops: The Line does not get war right at all, it does get the game right. I've already mentioned the dynamic, challenging, spectacular, and nearly non-stop combat. Spec Ops: The Line, from a gameplay perspective, is designed and executed amazingly well. And that means that even a very clumsy narrative still has a leg to stand on when it denounces the shooter genre as a whole. But only one leg, because it never deigns to acknowledge that it, too, is also a shooter subject to the same criticisms, or that Walker's choices in an almost entirely linear story are as much the game's responsibility as they are the player's. When the loading screen says, "How many Americans have you killed today?" I don't think, "Damn, that's a good point. How many have I killed?" Instead, I think, "As many as you've made me kill, stupid game. I just want to see the end already." But that is exactly the point. I, like Walker, don't want to admit that it could perhaps be my fault. That it might be my fault as a consumer that such unimaginably violent video games exist. It is my fault, our fault, for buying and playing them. That message is, of course, innately controversial and confrontational, but also unprecedented. I don't know of any other game, film, or book that holds its audience in such contempt, that so vociferously blames them for the very act of playing, watching, or reading. Parodies tread on that territory, perhaps making fun of their audiences, but this is far from comedic. It would be as though Heart of Darkness, in the end, threw out its anti-imperialism, instead turning around to criticize the very concept of the written word, denouncing Marlowe for ever telling his story and lambasting the reader for listening to it, for having the audacity to visualize the horrors he describes in their mind's eye. Doing something like that, of course, turns any piece of art into a martyr, dooming it never to succeed critically or commercially. But that narrative suicide has bought a different kind of immortality. Spec Ops: The Line may no longer be available for purchase, but thanks to its utter controversiality, it will be discussed and remembered for a long, long time.